On the morning of his 18th birthday, instead of a sweet cake and a mother's smile, Lucas received only a black trash bag and the cold announcement, "From today, you are no longer a burden to this household." Little did he know the very day he was kicked out would make him the sole heir to a billion-dollar empire. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon over San Jose when the knocking began. It was not the gentle, rhythmic rapping of a parent waking a child for a birthday breakfast. It was the sharp metallic strike of a coin against my bedroom door. I sat up in bed, my heart racing with a naive sense of anticipation. Today was March 15th. I was 18. In my mind, this was the day the world finally opened its doors to me. I imagined the smell of cinnamon rolls or perhaps a small cupcake with a single candle waiting in the kitchen. I pulled on a tattered sweatshirt and opened the door. Janet was already standing there. She did not say, "Happy birthday." She did not smile. She was holding a heavy-duty black garbage bag in her left hand and her iPad Pro in her right. "Downstairs, now," she said, her voice as flat as a dial tone. I followed her into the kitchen where the fluorescent lights hummed with a clinical intensity. Bill was already seated at the oak table, staring intensely at a spot on the linoleum floor, as if trying to disappear into the patterns. He avoided my gaze, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his work jacket. Janet sat at the head of the table and propped her iPad on a stand. She tapped the screen, and the familiar green and white grid of a spreadsheet reflected in her glasses. "Sit down, Lucas," she commanded. I pulled out the chair, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. Is something wrong, I thought, since it is my 18th birthday? "That is exactly why we are sitting here," Janet interrupted. She turned the iPad toward me. "As of midnight, you are a legal adult in the state of California. This means the foster-to-adopt subsidies we have been receiving for your care have officially terminated. The final deposit of $2,450 arrived yesterday. That was the last cent the government will ever pay us for your existence." I felt the air leave my lungs. "Subsidies I do not understand. I am your son." Janet's fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency. "You were a placement, Lucas, a commitment we made in 2007. We provided you with a stable environment, and in exchange the state provided us with the means to maintain that environment. It was a fair trade, but the contract has reached its expiration date." She scrolled down the spreadsheet. My eyes blurred as I saw row after row of dates and dollar amounts. It was a meticulous ledger of my entire life. "Look at the data," she said, pointing to a column labeled Net Expenditure. "I have kept track of every invoice since the day you arrived, from the initial cost of diapers and formula in 2007 to the increase in the electric bill once you started using that gaming computer. I even factored in the depreciation of the carpet in your bedroom. When you cross-reference the $2,450 monthly stipend against the cost of living in Silicon Valley, our profit margin was less than 8%. On the state stipend alone, we barely broke even, and that's the only ledger you need to see today." The warmth I had felt for this house, the place where I had learned to ride a bike and studied for my SATs, vanished. The walls felt like the sides of a shipping container. The beige paint was no longer homey. It was a cost-effective choice for property maintenance. "You're talking about me like I am a used car," I whispered. "I am talking about you like an adult," Janet countered. She reached under the table and tossed the black garbage bag onto the seat next to me. "That is for your clothes, your personal items only. Anything we purchased with the subsidy money, the laptop, the desk, the sneakers you are wearing, stays here. They are the property of this household." I looked at Bill, desperate for a spark of humanity. "Bill, are you really going to let her do this? You taught me how to fix engines. We spent every weekend in the garage." Bill finally looked up, but his eyes were empty of the fatherly warmth I thought I had earned. "The garage was for work, Lucas. You were good help, but Janet is right about the numbers. We have a mortgage to pay, and with the check stopping, we need to convert your room into a rental unit. We already listed it on Craigslist for $1,200 a month. A Google intern is coming to view the space at 1 o'clock this afternoon. Janet tapped the screen one last time, closing the file. "The clock is ticking. You have until noon to vacate the premises. I have already contacted the mobile provider to remove your line from our family plan. Your service will cut off at the end of the day. Plan accordingly." She stood up and walked toward the coffee maker, leaving me alone with the ledger of my life. I looked at the garbage bag. 18 years of memories of calling these people Mom and Dad had been reduced to a break-even analysis on a digital screen. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the cold rhythmic tapping of Janet's fingernails on the counter. I realized then that I had never lived in a home. I had lived in a long-term storage facility, and my time was up. The sound of Bill retreating to the garage was the finality I did not want to accept. The heavy fire door creaked and slammed shut, the deadbolt clicking into place. He was going back to his tools, and his silence leaving me to face the cold administrative wrath of Janet alone. He chose his inventory and his vintage Mustang over the boy he had called his son for nearly 2 decades. Janet stood in the center of the kitchen checking her gold wristwatch. "It is 10:15, Lucas. You are wasting valuable time. I have already spent $20 on the featured listing fee for Craigslist. Do not make me lose more money by having the room unprepared when the prospective tenant arrives." I stood up my legs, feeling like lead. "You really had the ad ready before my birthday even started. You were waiting for the clock to strike midnight just so you could post it. Efficiency is not a sin," she replied, her voice devoid of any tremor. "The market rate in San Jose is skyrocketing. Stalling would be a poor financial decision. The young man from the tech incubator is looking for a place close to the light rail. This room fits his budget of $1,200 perfectly. Unlike you, he will be an asset, not a dependent." I walked toward the hallway but stopped when I heard a distinctive chime from my pocket. I pulled out my phone. A notification was splashed across the screen in bright red letters, "Account deactivated. Please contact your primary account holder." "You already cut the service?" I asked, looking back at her. "The billing cycle resets today," Janet said, not looking up from her iPad. "I saw no reason to pay for another 30 days of data for someone who no longer contributes to this household. I have also submitted the paperwork to the health insurance provider. As of this moment, you are no longer covered under our plan. If you trip on your way out the door, the medical expenses are entirely your responsibility." The sheer speed of the erasure was breathtaking. In less than an hour, my identity in the Moore household had been systematically dismantled. My phone was a useless brick. My health was an uninsured liability. My bed was a future revenue stream for a stranger. I went to my room, or the room I had occupied, and began the grim task of packing. I looked at the desk where I had labored over college applications that now seemed like cruel jokes. I reached for my laptop, but Janet appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed. "Leave the computer, Lucas. It was purchased with the state-issued technology grant 4 years ago. It belongs to the state and, by extension, this house. The same goes for that high-intensity desk lamp and the ergonomic chair. I have the receipts in the master folder if you wish to dispute the ownership." I shoved my few Goodwill t-shirts and 2 pairs of worn jeans into the black plastic bag. I reached into the back of my closet and found a small wooden box where I kept my most precious items, a seashell from the only trip we ever took to Santa Cruz and a handmade card Bill had given me when I was 10. I hesitated, then dumped them into the trash bag. They felt like garbage now anyway. As I descended the stairs for the last time, the house felt unfamiliar, like a hotel room after checkout time. I walked toward the front door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Janet was waiting there, holding out her hand. "The keys, Lucas. House key, garage opener, and the spare you kept in your wallet. Hand them over." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the metal rings. I dropped them into her palm. They felt cold and heavy. I then reached into my back pocket and pulled out my wallet. I counted the bills. 2 20s at 10 and 2 crumpled ones. $52. That was the sum total of my net worth in the most expensive valley on earth. "I have nowhere to go, Janet," I said, a final desperate plea breaking through my pride. The shelters are full. It is $52. I will sleep on the floor. I will work double shifts at the repair shop and give you every penny. You do not have the income-to-debt ratio to qualify as a tenant here, she said, opening the front door. The bright California sunshine spilled into the hallway, blinding me. You would be a risk, and I am done taking risks on you. I stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, smelling of jasmine and car exhaust. Behind me, I heard the heavy thud of the door closing, then the sound of the deadbolt sliding home, then the security chain. I stood on the sidewalk of the suburban street I had known my entire life, holding a black garbage bag that contained everything I owned. I had no phone, no insurance, no family, and $52 in my pocket. I turned toward the bus stop at the end of the block and started walking, the plastic bag rustling against my leg like a mocking ghost of the life I had left behind. The first night at St. James Park was a lesson in the brutal reality of the American caste system. In the shadows of the high-rise luxury apartments of San Jose, where venture capitalists drank $20 cocktails, I sat on a cold stone bench and clutched my garbage bag. I quickly learned that being homeless in Silicon Valley is not just a lack of shelter. It is a total loss of personhood. Without an address, you do not exist to the government. Without a phone number, you do not exist to employers. And without a credit score, you are a ghost in the machine. I had $4,200 in my savings account money I had painstakingly earned over 3 years of scrubbing grease off engine blocks at the local repair shop. In many parts of the world, that would be a small fortune. In California, it was not even enough to get past a front door. Every morning, for 3 weeks, I used the free Wi-Fi at the public library to search for a studio apartment. I visited a dozen different leasing offices, my heart full of hope, because I had the cash in hand. But the conversations always ended at the same brick wall. The rent is $1,800. The property manager at a complex near San Pedro Square told me, not even looking up from her monitor. I need to see a credit score of 700 or hire a co-signer who earns 5 times the monthly rent and 3 months of verified pay stubs from a full-time employer. I have over $4,000 right now, I pleaded, leaning over the desk. I can pay you for the first 2 months in advance. I have a steady part-time job at a garage. I just need a chance to prove I am responsible. She finally looked at me, but her eyes were like Janet's, calculating and cold. $4,000 is nothing without a history, kid. You have a thin file, no credit cards, no prior rental history, no car loan. To our system, you are a high-risk ghost. Come back when you have a co-signer. I had no co-signer. The only 2 people who could have vouched for me had effectively deleted me from their lives. The American dream was locked behind a digital gate, and I did not have the key. By the 2nd month, the psychological toll began to manifest. The most difficult part was not the hunger, but the desperate struggle to maintain the appearance of being normal. If you look homeless in America, you are invisible. If you look dirty, you are a threat. Every morning at 6 o'clock, I would walk into the Starbucks on Market Street before the morning rush of tech workers arrived. I would buy the cheapest tall black coffee to justify my presence, then slip into the single-occupancy restroom. There, I would perform the frantic ritual of the sink shower. I used paper towels and liquid hand soap to scrub my skin, washing away the scent of the park and the night air. I brushed my teeth with water from the tap and used the hand dryer to blast the wrinkles out of my only clean button-down shirt. I stood in front of that cracked mirror staring at my reflection. I looked like a promising young man heading to a job interview, but beneath the clean collar, my ribs were starting to show. I was a master of a tragic masquerade. I would walk out into the sunshine past the rows of Teslas and electric scooters and head to job interviews at fast food chains and warehouses. "We love your energy, Lucas," a manager at a logistics center told me. "But our background check system flagged your address as a temporary shelter. We require a permanent residence for tax purposes and insurance liability. Get a lease, and then we can talk." It was a circular nightmare. I could not get a job without an address, and I could not get an address without a job and a credit score. I was trapped in a financial vacuum, watching my $4,000 slowly bleed away for bus passes, cheap protein bars, and laundromat fees. The heat of the California summer began to settle over the valley. At night, the park was a cacophony of sirens shouting and the low hum of the city that had no place for me. I watched the lights of the office towers where people were making millions of dollars by clicking buttons, while I struggled to figure out how to keep my shoes from falling apart. I realized that Janet had been right about one thing. The numbers were the only thing that mattered. In the eyes of Silicon Valley, I was a depreciated asset with no market value. I was 18 years old and I was already obsolete. I sat on my bench as the 90-day mark approached, feeling my spirit begin to break. I was no longer waiting for a miracle. I was simply waiting for the end of the day. I didn't know that a man in a tailored gray suit was currently moving through the city with a file that contained my name, my face, and the key to a world I could not even imagine. I was sitting on the concrete steps of the Martin Luther King Jr. Library trying to look like a student lost in thought rather than a boy with nowhere to go. My stomach was a hollow ache, and my boots were held together by a prayer and a strip of duct tape I had found behind a dumpster. That was when a pair of polished black leather shoes stopped directly in front of my feet. I did not look up immediately. In St. James Park, you learn that eye contact with a stranger in a suit usually leads to an interrogation, or an order to move along. Lucas Moore, the voice was deep gravelly and entirely too calm for the surroundings. I looked up. The man was in his 50s, wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked like it cost more than Bill and Janet's house. He held a manila folder in his gloved hand. He did not look like a social worker, and he certainly did not look like a police officer. "Who is asking?" I replied, my voice raspy from lack of use. "My name is Victor Thorne. I am a private investigator," he said, sitting down on the dirty step next to me without a hint of hesitation. He opened the folder and showed me a photograph. It was a school picture of me from the 10th grade. "I have been on you for 5 months. Your timing for turning 18 and disappearing was quite inconvenient. If you are here to collect a debt for Janet, you are out of luck," I said, clutching my garbage bag tighter. "I have nothing left." Victor Thorne let out a short, dry laugh. "Janet Moore is a footnote, Lucas. I am not here for her. I am here because of your father." The word hit me like a physical blow. "Bill, he knows where I am. He watched me walk away." "Not Bill." Victor corrected his expression, softening into something resembling pity. "Your biological father, Arthur Sterling. He has been searching for you since the day you were born." I felt a surge of dizziness. The name Sterling sounded like something out of a financial magazine, not something that belonged to me. Before I could ask a single question, Victor stood up and signaled to a black Cadillac Escalade idling at the curb. "I am not going to give you a lecture or a handout on this sidewalk," Victor said. "We are going to North First Street. There are people waiting to explain the rest." The drive through San Francisco's Silicon Valley was a blur of glass towers and manicured corporate campuses. I sat in the leather interior of the vehicle, acutely aware of the smell of the park clinging to my clothes. Victor did not offer me money or food. He offered me silence, which felt like a different kind of respect. We stopped in front of a skyscraper made of darkened glass. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and silent security guards. We ascended to the 44th floor, entering the offices of Vance and Associates. A woman named Claire Vance met us in a conference room that overlooked the entire valley. She looked at my tattered sweatshirt and my trash bag with a professional neutrality that made me feel more human than I had in months. "Lucas," Claire said, placing a heavy crystal paperweight on a stack of documents. "I am sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Arthur Sterling passed away 6 weeks ago. It was a massive heart attack. He died at his desk in his office in San Francisco." The world seemed to tilt. "You found me, just to tell me he is dead? Why now? Where was he for 18 years? Claire sighed and opened a digital file on a large monitor. A man's face appeared. He had my jawline, my dark hair, and the same slight furrow between his eyebrows when he was thinking. Arthur Sterling. a titan of venture capital, a man who had funded the very technologies that made this valley famous. He never stopped looking Lucas, Claire explained. He was 22 when you were born. Your mother died in childbirth, and Arthur's parents, your grandparents, convinced him he was too young and too unstable to raise a child alone. They orchestrated the adoption behind his back while he was in a state of grief. By the time he realized what had happened, the records were sealed under a mountain of legal iron. He spent the last 2 decades building an empire not for the money, but for the influence required to break those seals. She paused, her voice turning somber. He finally got the lead he needed 3 days before he died. He knew you were in San Jose. He was planning to come to your door on your 18th birthday. He had the car picked out. He had a reservation for dinner. He died with your name on his lips. I stared out the window at the sprawling city below. I had spent 18 years living in the shadows of Arthur Sterling's world, feeling unwanted and unloved, while the man who shared my blood was burning through millions of dollars just to find me. I had been so close to him, yet an ocean away. So he is gone. I whispered, the emptiness in my chest expanding until it felt like I was hollow. I finally find out who I am, and the only person who cared is a ghost. He may be a ghost, Lucas, Victor Thorne said from the corner of the room. But he left you his armor. He left you everything he ever built. Claire Vance pushed a single brass key and a thick stack of legal documents across the table. You are the sole heir to the Sterling estate. Arthur did not just leave you money. He left you his name, his companies, and the truth about the people who kept you from him. But first, you need to see what he kept for you. I looked at the brass key. It was cold, much like the keys I had dropped into Janet's hand 90 days ago. But this key did not open a rented room. It opened a life that had been waiting for me since the moment I was born. I felt a tear finally escape, not because I was rich, but because, for the first time in my life, I knew that someone had actually wanted me. I was a Sterling, and the boy with the garbage bag was about to disappear forever. Victor Thorne drove me to a nondescript industrial park in South San Francisco. We pulled up to a facility that looked like a standard high-security data center, but the interior was a fortress of glass and reinforced steel. Victor led me to a private vault in the sub-basement. I stood before a heavy titanium door that required a biometric scan and the brass key Claire Vance had given me. When the tumblers finally clicked and the door hissed open, I expected to see stacks of gold or rows of cold cash. Instead, I stepped into a room that looked like a sanctuary of a man's obsession. The walls were lined with climate-controlled shelves containing thousands of physical files, prototypes of hardware, and framed documents. In the center of the room sat a mahogany desk exactly like the one Arthur Sterling had died at. On the desk was a leather-bound ledger. I opened it, expecting more financial spreadsheets like the ones Janet had used to dehumanize me. What I found instead was a record of genius and love. The first shelf contained a series of patents. I pulled one out my breath, catching in my throat. It was a patent for a revolutionary liquid cooling system for servers filed 10 years ago. Arthur Sterling was listed as the inventor, but the ownership and royalties had been assigned to the Lucas Sterling Trust. He wasn't faking my genius. He was building my footing. Every major breakthrough Arthur's company had achieved over the last decade had been filed in my name. He had not just been building a fortune for me, he had been building a legacy where my name was already synonymous with innovation. He had created a world where I was a master of industry before I had even graduated high school. He wanted you to have your own standing, Victor whispered from the doorway. He did not want you to just be a trust fund kid. He wanted the world to owe you for its progress. But as I moved deeper into the vault, I found the active investigation section. This was where the air in the room turned cold. I found a thick file labeled The Moore Placement, Financial Tracking. I sat at the desk and began to read the bank statements and wire transfer receipts. My blood began to boil as the truth unraveled. Janet and Bill had not just been receiving the $2.450 monthly subsidy from the state of California. They had been playing a much more dangerous and profitable game. Beginning in 2008, an anonymous offshore trust managed by Arthur's lawyers, before he took full control of his firms, had been sending a discretionary maintenance fee to a private account owned by Janet Moore. The amount was $15,000 every single month. The condition for this money was explicit in the attached correspondence, to ensure the privacy and undisturbed development of the subject, ensuring no outside contact is made or sought. Janet had been taking $15,000 a month from my father to keep me safe, while simultaneously telling the state I was a burden to get their $2,000, and finally telling me I was a liability that barely broke even. She had been double-dipping into my existence for 18 years. She and Bill had pocketed over $3.2 million from that maintenance fee alone, before counting any state subsidy. Of my father's money, while forcing me to wear Goodwill clothes and eat generic cereal to save pennies. Then I found the most devastating piece of evidence. It was a formal cease and desist letter sent by Janet's lawyer to Arthur Sterling 3 years ago. Mr. Sterling, our clients Bill and Janet Moore insist that any further attempts to contact Lucas will be viewed as harassment and a violation of the adoption privacy statutes. Lucas is thriving and has expressed no interest in knowing his biological origins. Your continued interference will result in criminal charges. I let out a strangled cry. I had never been asked. I had never been told. I had spent my nights wondering why I felt like a stranger in my own home, while Janet was busy writing letters to my father, telling him I hated him all to ensure her income stream was never interrupted by a reunion. Janet had not just been cold, she had been a jailer. She had kept a father from his son and a son from his father for the sake of a monthly wire transfer. She had turned my life into a high-yield investment and then liquidated me the moment the state portion of the contract ended, likely planning to move to a beach house with the millions she had stolen from my future. I stood up, the brass key clenched so hard in my fist that it drew blood. I looked at Victor Thorne. She told me I was a bad investment, I said, my voice shaking with a new dangerous clarity. She told me I was a ghost with no credit and no history. She was lying, Lucas, Victor said, stepping aside to let me lead the way out. You own the bank now. You own the debt, and I believe it is time to collect. I walked out of the vault, leaving the boy with the garbage bag behind. I was Lucas Sterling. I was the architect of the technology Janet used every day, and I was the owner of the trust that had funded her secret life. The game of spreadsheets was over, and I was about to show Janet Moore exactly how it felt to be an unwanted liability. I did not return to the Moore household with a police escort or a shouting match. Violence was a currency for the desperate, and I was no longer desperate. I was a Sterling, and in Silicon Valley the most devastating weapon one could wield was a diversified portfolio and a team of ruthless attorneys. Under the guidance of Claire Vance, I initiated a series of rapid-fire financial maneuvers. I did not want Janet and Bill to simply be poor. I wanted them to experience the precise, cold systemic erasure they had inflicted on me. We operated through a shell company named March 15 Holdings. The first phase was the acquisition of their debt. Janet, ever the opportunist, had taken out a secondary mortgage on their home to fund a series of lifestyle investments that were now failing. Within 48 hours, March 15 Holdings had purchased that mortgage from the primary lender. I was now their landlord. Next, we looked into the hush money trust. Since the payments had been made under the fraudulent premise that they were providing for my well-being and facilitating my happiness, in claims proven false by my 90 days in St. James Park, we filed a preemptive freeze on their private accounts for breach of fiduciary duty. While the lawyers moved like silent predators through the digital ether, I visited my father's private residence in Pacific Heights. In the climate-controlled garage of the mansion, I found a vehicle draped in a silk cover. I pulled it back to reveal a 1967 Porsche 911S finished in a deep midnight blue. I opened the glove box and found a handwritten note from Arthur Sterling dated 2 years ago. For Lucas on his 16th birthday. A machine built with precision for a boy of character. I am still searching. I will find you. I sat in the driver's seat, the scent of vintage leather and oil filling my senses. Bill had kept me in the garage for years, forcing me to scrub the grime off old trucks, telling me I was not responsible enough to touch his Mustang. Meanwhile, my real father had been holding a masterpiece for me. I started the engine. The roar was not just mechanical. It was the sound of 18 years of suppressed truth finally finding its voice. I drove the Porsche back to the modest neighborhood in San Jose where I had grown up. I parked a block away and watched the house through a pair of high-powered binoculars. I saw Janet standing on the front porch, her iPad in hand, presumably welcoming the Google intern who had replaced me. She looked triumphant, as if she had successfully pruned a dead branch from a healthy tree. She had no idea that the landlord she was now paying her mortgage to was the boy she had kicked out with a trash bag. She did not know that her credit score, the very thing she used to mock me, was being systematically dismantled by a dozen lawsuits filed in the San Francisco Superior Court. "The eviction notice is ready, Lucas," Claire Vance told me over the car's speaker system. "We have documented proof that they used the hush money for personal luxuries while neglecting your basic dental and educational needs. We can freeze the accounts and move for a court-appointed receiver this week. Their control ends, first ownership is the final step." "Wait," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I do not want them out yet. I want them to receive the bills. I want them to feel the walls closing in. I want Janet to look at her spreadsheets and realize that every number is a zero. I want her to try to call for help and find that her service has been disconnected." I put the Porsche into gear and drove away. I was not playing a game of hate. I was playing a game of mathematics. Janet Moore believed that people were just entries on a ledger. I was going to ensure that by the time I was finished, she and Bill would be the most significant liabilities in the history of the Sterling estate. I would recover every cent of the hush money, every dollar of the stolen subsidies, and the very ground beneath their feet. They had treated me like a ghost, so I would turn their entire world into a phantom. I was sitting in Arthur Sterling's private study, surrounded by the remnants of a man who had made it his life's mission to find me. Victor Thorne had brought me a final box from the Sterling archives, a collection of personal journals that were never meant for public eyes. I opened the last volume, dated only months ago. The handwriting was erratic, stained with what looked like dried tears. As I read, the cold financial revenge I had planned suddenly felt insufficient. I had thought Janet Moore was merely a thief and a narcissist. I was wrong. She was a monster. In early January, Arthur had been closer than ever to breaking the legal seal on my adoption records. His journal entries were filled with hope, describing the nursery he was renovating in his mind, and the apologies he had practiced in the mirror. Then an entry dated January 12th changed everything. "I received a package today. No return address, but postmarked from San Jose. Inside was a death certificate and a photograph of a small unmarked headstone. The letter said Lucas died of pneumonia when he was 10 years old. They said they did not tell me because I had no legal right to know. My heart feels as though it has physically shattered. All these years, I've been searching for a ghost." I gasped for air, the journal slipping from my fingers. I looked at Victor, who was standing by the window with a grim expression. "She sent him a fake death certificate," I whispered, my voice trembling with a level of rage I had never experienced. "We found the digital trail on her laptop after our cybersecurity team bypassed her encryption," Victor said. "She used her old connections at the bank to forge the documents. She knew Arthur was getting close. She knew that if he found you, the monthly hush money would stop, and he would likely sue her for custody. She decided it was more profitable for you to be dead in his eyes than for her to lose her income stream." I returned to the journal. The entries following that date were a descent into darkness. Arthur had stopped eating. He stopped taking his heart medication. He wrote about how the world felt gray and meaningless without the hope of my return. He had lost the will to live because of a lie Janet had crafted for $15,000 a month. The final entry was written on the morning of March 13th. "I cannot sleep. I keep seeing his face. I built all of this for a boy who is buried in a grave I cannot find. If there is justice in this world, let me find him in the next. He had suffered a massive heart attack 5 hours later. Janet Moore had not just stolen my childhood, she had effectively killed my father with a calculated psychological blow. She had weaponized his love for me and used it to stop his heart. The fury that rose within me was white hot. This was no longer about mortgages or credit scores. This was about a woman who had looked at an innocent child and a grieving father and saw nothing but a transaction that needed to be protected at any cost, including human life. "Claire," I said, hitting the intercom on the mahogany desk, "change the strategy." "What are your instructions, Lucas?" Her voice came through crisp and ready. "Stop the civil proceedings. I do not want her money anymore. I want her freedom. I am handing over all the evidence of the forged government documents, the wire fraud, and the psychological extortion to the district attorney. I want Janet Moore indicted on felony fraud and manslaughter if the law allows it. I want a warrant the moment the DA can sign it, and the knock to happen the second it's legally clean. And I want to be the one to open the door for them." "And Bill?" Claire asked. "He stood by and watched it happen," I replied. "He took the money. He helped her hide the truth. He is an accomplice to every lie. Treat him exactly the same." I stood up and walked to the window looking out over the valley. My father had died believing I was under the earth, never knowing I was just a few miles away working in a garage and dreaming of a family. Janet had tried to bury me while I was still breathing, and in doing so, she had buried the only man who truly loved me. I picked up the brass key and the Porsche keys. Tomorrow was not about collecting a debt. Tomorrow was about the final audit of Janet Moore's soul. I was going back to that beige house in San Jose, but I was not going as the boy with the garbage bag. I was going as the living proof of her crimes, the ghost that had come back to ensure she would never see the sun as a free woman again. The sirens did not sound like a celebration. They sounded like an ending. I stood on the sidewalk across from the beige house in San Jose, leaning against the midnight blue Porsche. The neighborhood was quiet, the late morning sun casting long shadows across the driveways. At exactly noon, 3 black SUVs from the district attorney's office pulled to a stop in front of the Moore residence. I watched as the officers approached the door. When it opened, Janet was standing there with her iPad, her face already twisted into an expression of indignant authority. Her mouth moved, likely reciting some legal statute or demanding to see a warrant. Then the lead investigator stepped aside and she saw me. The color drained from her face so quickly it was as if a plug had been pulled. The iPad slipped from her hand, shattering on the tile floor she had made me mop every week for 18 years. Bill appeared behind her, his shoulders slumped, his face ashen. He did not look at the police. He looked at the car I was driving, the car he had known was mine for 2 years, but never dared to mention. I did not say a word as the handcuffs were clicked into place. I did not need to. The stacks of evidence, the forged death certificate, the laundered trust funds, and the systematic fraud spoke with a volume I could never match. As they were led to the cars, Janet's eyes locked onto mine. For the first time, there was no calculation in them. There was only the realization that the boy she had treated as a zero had become the force that would erase her world. "The house is officially seized, Mr. Sterling," Victor Thorne said, standing beside me. "The assets have been frozen. They have nothing left but the clothes they are wearing." "Good," I replied. "Give their clothes to a local shelter. Sell the rest of the furniture. Secure the premises today. Inventory everything. Nothing leaves without a chain of custody." I drove away without looking back. A week later, I stood on the glass balcony of the Sterling Tower in downtown San Francisco. The city sprawled out beneath me, a glittering sea of lights and ambition. I was no longer Lucas Moore, the liability. I was Lucas Sterling, the steward of a billion-dollar legacy. I sat at my father's desk and signed the final papers to incorporate Sterling Start. It was not just another tax-exempt foundation. It was a promise. We purchased 3 apartment complexes in the Bay Area to be converted into transitional housing for foster youth who, like me, were told the world ended at 18. We established a legal wing to investigate financial fraud in the adoption system, and a scholarship fund that did not care about the credit scores or cosigners. I realized then that money could buy a skyscraper, a vintage Porsche, and a team of the best lawyers in the country. It could buy comfort, security, and a very specific kind of justice. But as I looked at the school photo of myself Arthur had carried in his wallet until his final breath, the truth became undeniable. Money can buy the appearance of a family, but it can never purchase the soul of a parent. Janet had the numbers, but she never had the heart. Arthur had the heart, and even in death he gave me the world. I walked to the corner of the office where my old black garbage bag sat. I had kept it as a reminder. I reached inside and pulled out the small wooden box I had nearly thrown away. I took out the seashell from Santa Cruz. It was worthless to a spreadsheet, but to me it was the only thing from my childhood that felt real. I looked up at the portrait of Arthur Sterling hanging on the wall. He was smiling, his eyes reflecting the same quiet determination I now saw in my own. "I am home, Dad," I whispered to the quiet room. The weight of the 90 days in the park and the 18 years of cold dinners began to lift. I was no longer defined by what I had lost or what had been stolen from me. I was defined by what I chose to do next. I stepped back onto the balcony and looked toward the horizon. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet, colors that Janet would have called an unnecessary expense, but that my father had built an empire for me to see. I was Lucas Sterling, I was found, and I was finally truly free.